Jake Morrison had been awake for 36 hours straight, running courier routes through the contested border zones where the fragile ceasefire between humanity and the Valkyran Empire hung together through sheer diplomatic stubbornness and caffeine. His cargo pod contained what his supervisor had assured him were routine diplomatic communications. But the triple-encrypted data cores and biometric locks suggested something considerably more important than routine anything. Checkpoint Meridian loomed ahead through his transport's grimy viewport, a massive station that straddled the neutral zone like a mechanical spider, its docking arms extending toward ships from both species, with the kind of suspicious hospitality that characterized most border crossings. The facility served as one of the primary transit points between human and Valkyran space, processing everything from diplomatic envoys to humanitarian supplies under the watchful eyes of military personnel, who were still getting used to the idea of not shooting each other on sight. The Valkyrans were an impressive species by any measure, tall, powerful, and possessed of a warrior culture that had earned them a reputation as some of the most formidable fighters in known space. Their females were particularly noteworthy, trained from childhood in combat arts that made them feared opponents and respected allies. Jake had encountered Valkyran warriors before during his courier runs, and he'd learned to approach them with the kind of professional courtesy that acknowledged their capabilities without challenging their authority. Commander Zarathak was stationed at Checkpoint Meridian's primary inspection facility, where she oversaw security operations with the efficiency that had made her legendary among both human and Valkyran personnel. Jake had heard stories about her, a decorated veteran of the recent conflicts who had never lost a battle, and whose tactical brilliance was matched only by her unwavering dedication to Valkyran honor codes. The checkpoint's docking procedures were thorough but routine, designed to process legitimate traffic while screening for contraband, weapons, and unauthorized personnel. Jake submitted to the standard scans and identification protocols, his courier credentials granting him expedited processing that still required personal inspection by senior security staff. When Commander Zarathak stepped forward to review his documentation, Jake got his first close look at someone whose reputation had preceded her through every spaceport and military installation in the neutral zone. She was everything the stories claimed: imposing, graceful, and radiating the kind of controlled lethality that came from years of combat training and command responsibility. Her armor was a masterpiece of Valkyran engineering, combining advanced protective capabilities with aesthetic elements that emphasized the warrior's physical prowess. The design accentuated her muscular frame while providing complete protection, creating an appearance that was both functional and undeniably impressive. Every aspect of her equipment and bearing spoke to professional competence and personal discipline. Jake's exhaustion was beginning to affect his judgment in ways that his stimulant-enhanced alertness couldn't compensate for. 36 hours of continuous travel had left him operating on autopilot, his normal cultural awareness dulled by fatigue and the kind of mental fog that came from pushing human endurance beyond reasonable limits. As Commander Zarathak moved around his position to inspect his cargo manifest, Jake found himself appreciating the professionalism and physical capabilities that made Valkyran warriors so formidable. Her movements displayed the kind of precise control that came from decades of training, while her armor showcased the impressive physique that such training had developed. "You have a beautiful backside," Jake said, the words slipping out as an involuntary observation before his exhausted brain could engage the cultural filters that normally prevented such spectacular diplomatic disasters. The reaction was immediate and comprehensive. Every Valkyran in the checkpoint facility stopped what they were doing to stare at Jake with expressions that ranged from shock to awe to something that might have been horrified fascination. The inspection area fell completely silent except for the hum of processing equipment and the distant sound of Jake's dignity evacuating the premises at maximum velocity. Commander Zarathak herself had frozen in place, her expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and what appeared to be intense embarrassment as her typically pale Valkaran complexion darkened to a deep purple that Jake would later learn indicated severe blushing among her species. For a moment that felt like several geological ages, neither of them moved or spoke. "Did he just?" One of the Valkyran guards began. "He did," another confirmed with the kind of amazement typically reserved for witnessing impossible natural phenomena. Commander Zarathak slowly turned to face Jake, her expression suggesting that she was processing information that didn't fit any of her previous categories for diplomatic incidents. Her hand moved reflexively toward her sidearm, then paused as cultural protocols apparently override combat instincts. "Human courier," she said carefully, her voice carrying harmonics that Jake couldn't interpret, but that seemed to indicate some kind of formal declaration. "You have invoked the right of courtship challenge by publicly praising protected anatomy of a warrior in active duty. By the laws of honor and the customs of our people, you are seized for honor until an oath trial can determine your intentions and the appropriate response to your declaration." "Seized for what now?" Jake asked, his fatigue-addled brain struggling to process the implications of what he'd apparently triggered with his thoughtless compliment. "You are now my prisoner," Commander Zarathak explained with the kind of professional patience she might use when explaining tactical concepts to particularly slow recruits. "The right of courtship challenge creates specific legal obligations that require formal resolution through established judicial procedures." I didn't intend," Jake began, then realized that his situation had moved beyond simple cultural misunderstanding into territory that probably required legal representation and possibly divine intervention. "Intent will be determined by the oath trial," Commander Zarathak replied, gesturing for guards to escort Jake to what he hoped would be comfortable detention facilities. "Until then, you remain in my custody under Valkyran military law." As Jake was led away from the checkpoint's main processing area, he reflected that his supervisor's assurance about routine diplomatic communications had proven to be catastrophically inaccurate. His exhausted compliment about a warrior's backside had apparently triggered ancient Valkaran legal protocols that he didn't understand, placing him in the custody of someone whose reputation suggested that prisoners who displeased her tended to have short but eventful careers. But as he glanced back at Commander Zarathak, who was still dealing with the aftermath of his unprecedented cultural violation, Jake couldn't help but notice that despite her obvious embarrassment and professional consternation, she didn't seem particularly angry about his compliment. Confused, certainly. Overwhelmed by unexpected legal complications, absolutely. But not angry, which suggested that maybe, just maybe, his spectacular diplomatic disaster might not end with him being used as target practice for Valkaran weapons training. Though given his luck with courier assignments, he wasn't prepared to rule out any possibilities just yet. Jake's detention quarters aboard Checkpoint Meridian were considerably more comfortable than he'd expected for someone who had accidentally triggered what appeared to be an interstellar incident. The room was spacious, well-appointed, and equipped with amenities that suggested Valkaran military law made distinctions between different types of prisoners. Either that, or Commander Zarathak had very civilized ideas about appropriate hospitality for people who complimented her anatomy in public. "The right of courtship challenge," Commander Zarathak explained during their first formal meeting since his seizure, "is an ancient provision in Valkaran honor law that addresses situations where warriors receive public declarations that could be interpreted as romantic interest." She had changed from her combat armor into what appeared to be formal military dress, though Jake noticed that she still carried enough weapons to outfit a small army. Her embarrassment from the initial incident had been replaced by professional composure, but he could see traces of confusion in her expression that suggested she was navigating unfamiliar legal territory. "So when I said you had a beautiful backside," Jake ventured, still trying to understand the scope of his cultural mistake, "that counted as a romantic declaration." In Valkyran warrior culture, the posterior region is considered sacred to combat identity. She replied with the kind of clinical precision that suggested she was reciting from memory rather than discussing personal anatomy. Public appreciation of a warrior's protected areas by a non-Valkyran constitutes formal courtship challenge that creates specific obligations for both parties. And those obligations include taking me prisoner. "Seized for honor," she corrected. "The distinction is important. You are not a criminal or enemy combatant. You are a civilian whose intentions must be evaluated through proper judicial procedures to determine appropriate response." Jake was beginning to understand that his situation was less like being arrested, and more like being caught in an elaborate cultural ceremony that no one had expected a human to trigger. The seized for honor status apparently granted him certain protections, while also making him subject to Valkyran military law rather than the diplomatic protocols that normally governed courier operations. "How long does this oath trial process usually take?" he asked. "There is no precedent," Commander Zarathak admitted. "No non-Valkyran has ever invoked the right of courtship challenge. The legal scholars are reviewing ancient texts to determine proper procedures." Their conversation was interrupted by alerts from the checkpoint security systems, which had apparently been conducting enhanced scans of Jake's equipment and credentials during his detention. Commander Zarathak studied the readouts with growing concern, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to sharp military focus. "Your courier badge contains authorization codes that don't match your stated routes," she observed, highlighting discrepancies in the scanner data. "These relay keys provide access to communication networks and supply chains that aren't listed in your official documentation." Jake examined the information with growing alarm, recognizing some of the network identifiers but not understanding how they'd become associated with his credentials. "I've never seen half of these codes before. My supervisor gave me standard courier authorization for diplomatic communication runs. These codes grant access to facilities and transportation networks that handle much more than diplomatic communications," Commander Zarathak said, cross-referencing the scanner data with intelligence databases. "Some of these networks have been flagged for suspected smuggling activities." The implications were disturbing and potentially disastrous for Jake's situation. If his courier credentials had been compromised to support illegal activities, he could be facing charges that went far beyond cultural misunderstandings about warrior anatomy. Worse still, the evidence suggested that he'd been unwittingly carrying materials for criminal networks that exploited the chaos and displacement caused by recent conflicts. "I need to review these networks," Commander Zarathak declared, activating security protocols that granted her access to intelligence files normally restricted to senior military personnel. "Your seized for honor status places you under my personal authority, which means I'm responsible for investigating any criminal activities associated with your case." As they worked together to trace the suspicious authorization codes, Jake discovered that his seized for honor relationship with Commander Zarathak created unexpected opportunities for cooperation. Valkyran honor law granted them joint authority over evidence that affected his case, allowing him to access security systems and review intelligence that would normally be far beyond his clearance level. "These shipping manifests show your courier routes have been systematically modified," Commander Zarathak observed, highlighting patterns in the transportation data. "Your standard runs between diplomatic outposts have been altered to include stops at facilities that handle much more than legitimate communications." Jake traced his recent assignments, recognizing the locations but not understanding how his routes had been manipulated without his knowledge. These supply depots were supposed to be routine stops for fuel and maintenance. I never picked up or delivered anything beyond my normal cargo. The facilities appear legitimate on the surface, she agreed, but they're also connected to networks that transport contraband, weapons, and... She paused, her expression darkening as she accessed classified intelligence reports, trafficked persons through the neutral zone. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. His courier service hadn't just been compromised to support smuggling. It had been used as cover for human trafficking operations that exploited refugee populations displaced by the recent conflicts. People who should have been receiving humanitarian assistance were instead being transported to illegal research facilities and forced labor operations. How long has this been going on? He asked, studying shipping records that showed systematic exploitation dating back months. The network appears to have been operating since the ceasefire began, Commander Zarathak replied, her military training helping her analyze the operational patterns. They've been using legitimate diplomatic and humanitarian infrastructure as cover for criminal activities. As they continued their investigation, Jake began to appreciate the complexity of his captor's position. Commander Zarathak wasn't just responsible for resolving his cultural violation. She was now investigating a conspiracy that threatened the stability of the ceasefire and the safety of vulnerable populations throughout the neutral zone. The oath trial, he realized. It's not just about determining my romantic intentions, is it? No, she confirmed. It's about evaluating whether our seized for honor relationship represents a genuine partnership that can address these criminal activities, or merely a cultural accident that should be dissolved to prevent complications. Jake looked at the evidence they'd uncovered, documented proof of trafficking networks that used courier services to transport victims, humanitarian supplies diverted to black market sales, and refugee camps used as recruitment centers for forced labor. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, but their joint authority under Valkyr honor law might be the only way to expose it. What happens if we validate the bond during the oath trial? He asked. We gain permanent joint authority to combat these criminal networks, Commander Zarathak replied. But we also formalize a partnership that transcends normal diplomatic limitations and creates obligations that neither of us chose. And if we repudiate it? You return to your courier duties, I return to checkpoint security, and this evidence remains classified while the trafficking continues. Jake studied Commander Zarathak's expression, seeing the weight of command responsibility and personal honor that made this decision more complex than simple legal procedures. Their accidental partnership had revealed crimes against both their species, but addressing those crimes would require them to commit to a relationship that neither had expected or planned. How much time do we have to decide? He asked. The oath trial begins at dawn, she replied. 6 hours to determine whether your compliment about my backside leads to a partnership that could save thousands of lives, or remains just an embarrassing cultural misunderstanding that we both try to forget. As they continued reviewing the evidence that their joint investigation had uncovered, Jake reflected that his exhausted appreciation for Valkyrian warrior physique had led to consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. But with Commander Zarathak's guidance and their combined access to intelligence networks, he was beginning to believe they might actually be able to make a difference that mattered. As the hours until dawn dwindled, Jake and Commander Zarathak's investigation into the smuggling network revealed a conspiracy far more extensive and sinister than either had initially suspected. The trafficking operation wasn't just exploiting the current refugee crisis. It was actively working to perpetuate and expand it by sabotaging humanitarian efforts and manipulating ceasefire negotiations to maintain profitable instability. These communication intercepts show coordination between courier dispatch centers and trafficking facilities. Commander Zarathak observed, her military intelligence training helping her decode the encrypted messages that revealed the conspiracy's operational structure. Your routes weren't randomly compromised. They were specifically selected to support systematic exploitation of displaced populations. Jake traced the network connections through his technical background, finding patterns in the data that painted a horrifying picture of they're being deliberately starved of resources to create desperation that makes trafficking easier. The evidence showed how humanitarian supplies meant for refugee assistance were being diverted to black market sales, while legitimate aid requests were buried in bureaucratic obstacles created by officials who profited from maintaining crisis conditions. Medical supplies, food shipments, and temporary shelter materials all disappeared into networks that sold them for massive profits while vulnerable populations suffered. The trafficking routes follow the same patterns as legitimate courier services. Commander Zarathak discovered, cross-referencing transportation schedules with missing person reports from refugee camps. They're using diplomatic credentials and humanitarian cover to transport victims without triggering security alerts. Jake felt sick as he understood the scope of what his courier service had been used to facilitate. How many people have been transported through networks that I helped maintain without knowing it? Thousands, she replied grimly, studying casualty reports and population data that showed systematic disappearance of refugees from camps throughout the neutral zone. The operation has been running for months, using legitimate infrastructure to support criminal activities. Their investigation was complicated by the knowledge that powerful interests on both sides had been working to maintain the profitable status quo. The trafficking network included corrupt officials in both human and Valkyran governments, who had found ways to exploit the chaos and displacement created by decades of conflict. The ceasefire negotiations themselves have been manipulated, Commander Zarathak realized, accessing diplomatic files that showed systematic sabotage of peace initiatives. Every time our species approach lasting resolution, someone creates incidents that force us back to the bargaining table, maintaining exactly the right level of instability, Jake added, understanding the strategy. Enough chaos to justify military contracts and emergency powers, but not enough open warfare to trigger the oversight and accountability that would threaten their operations. As they pieced together the conspiracy, Jake began to appreciate the personal courage that Commander Zarathak was demonstrating by pursuing their investigation. As a senior military officer, she had career incentives to avoid complications that might reflect poorly on her judgment. Her willingness to investigate criminal activities revealed by their seized for honor relationship spoke to a moral integrity that transcended professional considerations. The oath trial procedures grant us authority to present this evidence, she explained, reviewing the ancient Valkyran legal texts that governed their situation. But using that authority would mean exposing criminal networks that include officials from both our governments. What kind of response can we expect from people who profit from human trafficking? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. They'll try to discredit our evidence, question our motives, and possibly arrange for accidents that eliminate inconvenient witnesses, she replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who understood the stakes involved. Validating our bond would make us permanent targets for very dangerous people. Their conversation was interrupted by security alerts, indicating unusual activity around the checkpoint facility. Multiple vessels had arrived requesting priority docking clearance, their credentials identifying them as diplomatic transports from both human and Valkyran space. However, the scanner readings suggested military-grade equipment and personnel that seemed inconsistent with routine diplomatic missions. Someone's mobilizing response teams, Commander Zarathak observed, studying the vessel configurations and approach patterns. These ships are carrying personnel who specialize in containment operations rather than diplomatic negotiations. Containment of what? Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect that he and Commander Zarathak had become problems that powerful people wanted to solve quickly and quietly. Containment of inconvenient investigations and the people conducting them, she replied, activating security protocols that locked down their current location while alerting loyal personnel throughout the facility. Our evidence threatens criminal networks that have significant resources and government connections. As the external pressure mounted, Jake and Commander Zarathak found themselves facing the ultimate test of their accidental partnership. The oath trial would determine not just the legal status of their relationship, but whether they would have the authority and protection needed to expose the trafficking conspiracy before hostile forces could silence them. The validation ceremony, Commander Zarathak explained, preparing for what might be their final opportunity to present their evidence, requires both parties to publicly affirm their bond before witnesses from both species. Once validated, the bond grants permanent joint authority over matters affecting either party's honor or safety. And if we repudiate it, we return to our separate duties while the conspiracy continues, and the people mobilizing against us have no legal obligations to respect our welfare or our evidence. Jake studied the data they'd gathered, documented proof of systematic exploitation that could save thousands of lives if exposed. But that would also make them permanent enemies of people who had already demonstrated their willingness to engage in systematic atrocities for profit. The dawn ceremony, he said, understanding that their choice would determine far more than just their personal relationship. We either validate our bond and expose the conspiracy, or we walk away and let the trafficking continue. There is a third option, Commander Zarathak said quietly, checking her weapons and preparing for possible combat. We could attempt to escape and try to present our evidence through other channels. How likely is that to succeed? Not very. The networks we've uncovered have connections throughout both governmental systems. Normal channels would likely bury our evidence while eliminating us as threats. As they prepared for the dawn ceremony that would determine the fate of their investigation and their lives, Jake reflected that his exhausted compliment about Valkyran warrior anatomy had led to the most important decision of his life. Their accidental partnership had revealed horrors that demanded action, but taking that action would require them to formalize a bond that neither had chosen. But that might be their only hope of protecting the vulnerable populations being exploited by the conspiracy they'd uncovered. "Commander," he said, watching the external monitors that showed hostile forces positioning themselves around the facility, "I want you to know that regardless of how this oath trial turns out, working with you has been the most important thing I've ever done. If my stupid compliment leads to exposing this trafficking network, then maybe it was the best mistake I've ever made." Commander Zarathak's expression softened slightly, her warrior composure revealing glimpses of the person beneath the military authority. "Jake Morrison," she said, using his name rather than his formal designation for the first time, "your appreciation for Valkyran anatomy may have been culturally inappropriate, but your commitment to justice has been exemplary. Whatever happens at dawn, you have earned my respect as both an investigator and as someone worthy of the bond we accidentally created." The facility's communication systems activated with priority alerts as the hostile forces outside began demanding access to the checkpoint's detention facilities. Claims of security concerns and diplomatic incidents requiring immediate resolution provided thin cover for what were clearly extraction and elimination operations designed to silence their investigation before it could threaten the profitable trafficking networks. "They're running out of time," Commander Zarathak observed, studying the increasingly desperate communication attempts from the forces outside. "Dawn is in 2 hours, and they know that once we validate our bond, they'll have to deal with us as a legally protected partnership rather than isolated individuals." "What exactly does validation give us that we don't have now?" Jake asked, understanding that their choice would determine more than just personal commitment. Permanent joint authority over humanitarian operations in the neutral zone, emergency powers to override bureaucratic obstacles that prevent refugee assistance, and legal protection that makes it much more difficult for our enemies to simply eliminate us, she explained. But it also makes our partnership permanent under Valkyran honor law, with obligations and responsibilities that extend far beyond this investigation. Jake considered the implications, binding himself permanently to someone from another species, accepting responsibilities he hadn't chosen, and making himself a permanent target for criminal networks that spanned multiple governments. Against those costs, he weighed the thousands of lives that could be saved if their evidence exposed the trafficking conspiracy and opened the refugee corridors that had been deliberately blocked. The ceremony itself, he asked, what does it involve? Public declaration before witnesses from both species, formal affirmation of shared purpose and mutual commitment, and activation of joint authority protocols that cannot be revoked by external pressure, Commander Zarathak replied. It's essentially a permanent partnership that transcends individual identity or species loyalty. As they prepared for what might be their final hours together, Jake found himself reflecting on the unexpected partnership that had developed from his cultural disaster. Commander Zarathak had proven to be not just an impressive warrior, but a dedicated investigator whose moral courage matched her tactical abilities. Their collaboration had revealed capabilities that neither possessed alone, his technical knowledge combining with her military expertise to uncover evidence that could save lives throughout the neutral zone. "There's something I should tell you," Commander Zarathak said, as they monitored the hostile forces' increasingly aggressive attempts to gain access to the facility. "My initial embarrassment at your compliment wasn't entirely due to cultural violation. Valkyran warriors aren't supposed to be affected by appreciation from other species, but your words were not unwelcome." Jake looked at her with surprise, seeing vulnerability beneath the professional warrior facade that she'd maintained throughout their investigation. "Are you saying that my comment about your backside was actually flattering, rather than just embarrassing?" "I'm saying that your ability to see past species differences and appreciate individual worth has been more meaningful than you might realize," she replied, her skin showing subtle color changes that suggested complex emotions. "The bond we're considering isn't just about legal convenience. It's about choosing to trust each other with responsibilities that neither of us can handle alone." The dawn ceremony approached as hostile forces outside prepared for final attempts to prevent their validation. Jake and Commander Zarathak had 2 hours to decide whether to formalize a partnership that could expose criminal conspiracy and save thousands of lives, or to walk away and let profitable suffering continue while protecting their individual freedom and safety. As they reviewed their evidence one final time, both understood that their choice would determine not just their personal futures, but the fate of every vulnerable person trapped in the trafficking networks they'd uncovered. Jake's exhausted appreciation for Valkyran warrior physique had led to the discovery of systematic atrocities, and now they had to decide whether their accidental partnership was worth making permanent to address the crimes they'd exposed. Dawn arrived at Checkpoint Meridian with the kind of crystalline clarity that made life-changing decisions feel inevitable. Jake and Commander Zarathak stood before the assembled tribunal of Valkyran honor judges and human diplomatic observers, their choice having been made during the dark hours when hostile forces had attempted increasingly desperate measures to prevent the oath trial from proceeding. The validation ceremony took place in the Checkpoint's Central Assembly Hall, which had been hastily converted into a formal courtroom that could accommodate representatives from both species. The hostile forces outside had been forced to maintain their positions as observers rather than participants, their attempts at interference blocked by the legal protections that surrounded official Valkyran honor proceedings. The oath trial will determine whether the bond created by formal courtship challenge represents genuine partnership worthy of validation, or mere cultural accident that should be dissolved, announced Senior Honor Judge Velthar, whose ancient authority commanded respect from both species. The evidence presented will be evaluated not just for personal intent, but for its implications regarding shared responsibility and mutual commitment. Jake began his testimony by acknowledging the cultural inappropriateness of his original compliment, while explaining the exhaustion and stress that had led to his poor judgment. However, his statement focused primarily on the investigation that had followed his seizure for honor, and the evidence they had uncovered about systematic exploitation of refugee populations. "My compliment about Commander Zarathak's anatomy was inappropriate," he stated formally, "but the partnership that developed from our investigation has revealed criminal activities that threaten both our species. The trafficking networks we've exposed use diplomatic infrastructure to transport victims, while corrupt officials profit from maintaining refugee crises that should have been resolved months ago." Commander Zarathak presented the comprehensive evidence they had gathered: shipping manifests showing systematic diversion of humanitarian supplies, communication intercepts revealing coordination between supposed enemies, and financial records proving massive profits from illegal activities. The documentation was undeniable in its scope and horrifying in its implications. "The seized for honor relationship granted us joint authority that revealed crimes against both species," she testified. "Our investigation has shown that refugee assistance has been deliberately blocked to maintain supply sources for trafficking operations, while legitimate peace negotiations have been sabotaged by individuals who profit from controlled instability." As the evidence streamed across display screens throughout the assembly hall, representatives from both governments watched in growing alarm as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The trafficking network included officials at the highest levels of both species' administrative systems, using humanitarian crises as cover for systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. "The validation of this bond," Senior Honor Judge Velthar observed, "would grant permanent joint authority over humanitarian operations and emergency powers to override bureaucratic obstacles that prevent assistance to displaced populations. Do both parties understand the permanent nature of this commitment?" "We do," Jake and Commander Zarathak replied simultaneously, their shared understanding having developed through days of investigation and cooperation that had revealed capabilities neither possessed alone. The formal validation ceremony required them to recite ancient oaths that committed them to shared responsibility for justice and protection of vulnerable populations. As they spoke the words that would bind them permanently under Valkyran honor law, the checkpoint systems activated emergency protocols that immediately opened sealed refugee corridors and deployed humanitarian assistance that had been held back by bureaucratic obstruction. "By joint authority of the validated bond," Commander Zarathak announced as their ceremony concluded, "we activate emergency evacuation protocols for all refugee populations currently held in facilities connected to the trafficking networks we have exposed." Throughout the neutral zone, transportation systems that had been restricted by artificial bureaucratic delays suddenly opened to allow displaced populations to reach safety. Medical supplies that had been diverted to black market sales were redirected to refugee camps that had been deliberately starved of resources. Emergency communications networks began broadcasting safe passage codes and evacuation instructions to vulnerable communities that had been trapped by systematic exploitation. The hostile forces that had attempted to prevent their validation found themselves facing joint human-Valkyran enforcement teams, authorized to investigate and prosecute trafficking operations. The evidence Jake and Commander Zarathak had gathered triggered coordinated raids throughout both species' territories, leading to arrests of corrupt officials and the dismantling of criminal networks that had exploited humanitarian crises for profit. 6 months later, Jake stood in the operations center of the Joint Anti-Trafficking Command, reviewing reports from enforcement teams that had largely eliminated the smuggling networks that had once exploited refugee populations throughout the neutral zone. His partnership with Commander Zarathak had evolved into a professional relationship that served as a model for broader cooperation between humans and Valkyrans. The Andromedan refugee settlements are reporting full self-sufficiency ahead of schedule, Commander Zarathak reported, her warrior discipline now focused on humanitarian coordination rather than military operations. The communities we helped establish are thriving without external assistance. The new transparency protocols are working better than expected, Jake added, studying technical specifications for oversight systems that made future trafficking operations much more difficult to maintain. The joint authority requirements have eliminated most opportunities for systematic exploitation. Their relationship had been formalized under Valkyran honor law as a bond of shared purpose, rather than romantic partnership. But their effectiveness as partners had led to expanded cooperation programs that allowed other humans and Valkyrans to work together on joint humanitarian missions. The validation ceremony that had begun with Jake's inappropriate compliment about Commander Zarathak's anatomy had become a model for the kind of commitment that made lasting peace possible. Any regrets about the comment that started all this? Commander Zarathak asked, noting the reports from colonies where former trafficking victims were building new lives free from exploitation. None, Jake replied honestly, watching data streams that showed thousands of people whose lives had been saved by their investigation. Though I have to admit, when I complimented your backside, I never expected it would lead to co-administering an interstellar anti-trafficking network. Your appreciation for Valkyran warrior physique may have been culturally inappropriate, she agreed, her expression showing the subtle amusement that had developed through months of working together. But your commitment to justice has proven exemplary. Our partnership has demonstrated that sometimes the most important bonds form through the most unexpected circumstances. The refugee corridors they had opened during their validation ceremony continued to operate as permanent safe passages for displaced populations, while the enforcement capabilities they had created prevented the kind of systematic exploitation that had once made humanitarian crises profitable for criminal networks. Jake's exhausted compliment about Commander Zarathak's backside had become a legend among both species, a reminder that dignity and respect could transcend cultural boundaries to create partnerships that addressed shared challenges. As they continued their work coordinating humanitarian operations and anti-trafficking enforcement, Jake reflected that his most embarrassing cultural mistake had led to the most meaningful work of his life. The seized for honor relationship that had begun with inappropriate appreciation for alien anatomy had evolved into a commitment to justice that protected vulnerable populations throughout the galaxy. Their bond remained formally defined by Valkyran honor law, but their shared dedication to humanitarian protection had created something far more significant than either had initially imagined. Jake's inadvertent compliment had indeed been about Commander Zarathak's beautiful backside, but their partnership